Hey, welcome to my first ever tutorial on YouTube. Today we're going to be doing something that has been highly suggested. We're going to start off with outlining and then move on to skin shading. On the left you can see step-by-step tutorials, and I'll also be talking it through. To start off with, I lower the opacity on the layer of the character that I have imported and basically just start outlining it. If I want to use the episode pose, I'll outline the pose or draw my own. The brush I'm using here is from my own pack, but you can also use the recommendations on the side. Once finished outlining, I'll simply move on to shading. When it comes to shading, I'll use the eyedropper tool to begin finding the base colour. Here I'd already shaded the base of the face, but I needed to change the colour because it wasn't suitable, so later on you'll be seeing me changing the colour. Then once I've got my base colour, I'll simply just move on to laying the base down. This sometimes takes me a while due to the fact that I don't always close my lines, meaning I can't drop a bucket in and fill the full layer. Also, I'm really sorry if I don't cover everything in this. You can always comment any questions you have and I'll try to answer them, or contact me via Instagram, where you can find most of my edits anyway. So to put down the base colour for the skin, I'll usually use my base brush that I've created for Procreate. My brush sets are actually available if you go via my Instagram. You can find them through my website. If you have any questions regarding that, please leave them in the comments. Here I tried to sort of outline the hand with the base so that I could drop the colour in using Procreate's colour drop tool, so that I didn't have to shade the full of the hand. However, first time it didn't exactly work how I had planned. Also, I want to add an apology for if I sound quite tired or asleep during this. I'm also suffering from a cold at the moment, but I really wanted to get this video out for you. So once I've got the base colour, here I'm just adjusting the tone because I thought it was a bit too dark for my base. And then I'm still adjusting it. So yeah, once I've got my base colour, I usually add a layer and clip it. Then I go to multiply and adjust it to around 50% opacity. There I do a quick squiggle and eyedrop that colour. Then I delete the multiply layer and create a new layer. Then I begin shading with my base brush, which I then use a smudging brush by a user that I bought off of Instagram to smudge most of my hard shading marks out. But this is just my preference, and if you wish to contour in a different style, that is completely fine. Everyone has different styles. This is purely just a guide to help you. Here I'm just smudging out the nose because this is my preference of how I like to draw noses. In this outline, I kind of went for a bit more of a challenging nose compared to what I usually edit. However, I think it turned out alright in the end. Whilst I edit this, I will just make it clear that this tutorial, like these tutorials, will become more frequent, and I'm going to be doing a step-by-step class. So we'll begin with simple ways to edit and go into more detail as we get along, meaning more complex ways of shading and things like that as we go along. I'll also be highlighting separate things during the time as we go along. So here we begin with outlining and skin shading, moving on to facial features, hair shading, clothes shading, and maybe even choosing the right background, because I know that I used to struggle with that a lot. I may also cover custom poses and drawing your own clothes, because drawing my own clothes is something that I really love to create. Whereas usually I don't really follow the episode clothes, I just will sometimes do it. I'm using it in this tutorial to make it easier for you to understand. Here I was just figuring out how I wanted to shade the nose. It's great as you edit to try different views and different techniques. Here I'm just adding the shading under the nose where the shadows should be. When you want to start shading, you want to picture where the shadows would be on the face and add in some more in if it suits your style. So usually I will highlight, if I'm going to highlight, I'll highlight the tip of the nose and where the light hits. If I'm going to shade, I'll shade eyelids, like the crease in the eyelids, under the lips, under the nose, to the nose to define the nose, and anywhere else I want to define, such as the cheekbones. You can also add blusher if you wish to add blusher, just depending on your style. Here I decided to take an airbrush and then I lowered the size in to match how I wanted it to look. Here I'm just shading around the hairline, just to give it a bit of shadow and a bit more depth to the edit. Whilst you're shading skin, you will want to make some of your shadows a bit darker than the rest. So you'll also want to adjust the hue to make it, well, to give it more depth. So then you'll want to go in with maybe a reddish hue or a darker orange hue, depending on your skin tone. Here I was going in with an airbrush to shape the creases around your eyes. This is just a preference of how I edit with my own style, but you can try different styles and find out what works for you best. I wouldn't suggest copying another person's style, but maybe picking something you like and adapting it to your own. Just do not copy the whole style. Try to adapt. Here I'm also shading the eyelids, just to give them a bit more depth. Here you can also add eyeshadow if you wish, and any eye makeup. Once I'm done with shading the face, I'll then move on to other parts of the body. Roughly, I'll always move on to the neck first and add the necklines and the parts on your neck that you need shadows. Often underneath the face as well, to give it that texture and depth. Here I'll smudge out part of it and also use an airbrush in others. For shading arms, I like to add lines and often where the creases are. And sometimes I'll do this with an airbrush or sometimes with a base brush and blend it out. It just depends on the pose and how the arm is bending. When it comes to hands, this is probably one of my hardest places to shade. I'll usually start off with a base brush and put down some lines like I am right now. Often hands take me probably one of the most amount of times, including the face. Hands and face are probably what take the longest for me. This is just to add the lines of where the fingers bend and where the knuckles are. Then I'll take the blur in a moment, and using the blur just blurs out the hard shading a tad, so it's not so harsh. I'll then merge that down and go back, add another clipping layer, which is what I do throughout. I never shade all on the same layer. I always clip my layers and then merge them down and then create new layers, depending on what I'm shading. Now I'm moving on to highlighting. For highlighting, I'll add a new layer and then clip it. Then I'll adjust it to be a screen layer. Then here I took an airbrush just to add some light into where the creases are under your eyes. I also like to add this here, just part of like the makeup highlighter. I'll then add highlighting touches all around the face just to give it that extra pop and to give it a bit more depth. I'll then add a bit of highlight to the arms and then move on to the hands. Here I like to add a tiny bit of highlighting to each of the knuckles just to make them stand out. And then sometimes I like to add them along the fingers depending on what way they're facing. The brushes you use for either highlighting or shading can really depend on your preference, but for hard shading I would suggest a hard brush such as the dip pen in Ibis Paint, or in Procreate the gel pen. What else do we have in Procreate? Any of the ink pens should work for hard shading. And then for more soft shading, you could use an airbrush or any hard shading pencil and then blend it out a lot, either using the blend or a smudging tool. One thing I also love to add into my edits is freckles, and I think they really make the character stand out and creates a different look. For freckles, you can use a multiple of pens. You can use airbrushes or hard pens. Here I used hard pens and dabbed a few little dots everywhere. Then I checked that it looked suitable. I like to give a few over the nose as well. Then I went to the blur, blurred it out just a little bit, and then I was done. Thank you so much for watching, and don't forget to check out my Instagram.